My daughter-in-law thought I was broke. She never checked the deed in my name. I say it now because I remember how ordinary the morning was. I had the pie in my hands, an apple pie, crust browned just right, the kind of pie my mother taught me to weave with floured fingers, and I drove to their house unannounced. I don't know why I went. Maybe because of the weather, the way the light landed on the hedges, or because stubbornness is a family trait. Maybe because I wanted to show up with something ordinary in my hands to anchor the day before anything imploded. Frank's SUV was in the driveway. His SUV was not meant to be there on a Tuesday morning at 10. That small detail lodged itself in my chest like a pebble. I walked up the path with the ceramic dish sweating in my palms. Gravel crunched under my shoes. The hydrangeas were already heavy with bloom. I could hear laughter, hallway sound that had nothing to do with the garden or the sky. Laughter that was too close, too intimate, and then Claire's voice, the soft cadence that used to feel like the voice of someone who could sit across a table at holiday dinners. She said plainly, as if she were sealing a bargain, "If your son ever finds out, we're done." The pie slipped from my fingers and hit the flagstones with a dull, ordinary sound. No dramatic splatter, no cinematic moment. The fruit and sugar didn't explode into cymbal. They simply fell apart. For a second, I watched the crust split and a sliver of steam rise. Then I stepped back as if the sound had been an act of violence, and my knees gave way on the path. I sat there with my breath gone and let everything happen around me. The scent of butter, the warmth of the sun, the faint perfume of someone closing a door. I thought of every small kindness Frank had offered over the years, the folded napkins, the way he warmed my car seat in winter, and they all unraveled like the lattice on that pie. I left without knocking. I drove home on autopilot, hands on the wheel, the radio a thin hum of static, and the town looked the same. The postman walked his route. Mrs. Burton's cat sat on a fence. The ordinary world went about its ordinary business, and my life had a jagged edge through it that no one could see. At home, I stood in the kitchen with the empty pie dish in my hands, burning coffee left on the counter, and I felt a small private thing split open, something like trust or the idea of a shared life. There is a moment after the shock where you either shatter or plan. I remember leaning my forehead against the cool window pane and making a very quiet promise, not an oath with fireworks or threats, just a steady, practical vow. I will not be left with nothing. I will not be played for a fool. I will not let this erase what I built. I had never managed the money. Frank had always handled the accounts. He liked numbers the way some people liked puzzles. I knew how much the gardener cost, how many cans of paint lined the garage shelf, but the accounts and the ledgers were his territory. It was a convenience at first. It is easy to let someone you love take the sticky, small tasks that eat at your day. You trust, you call it partnership. Later, you find convenience has a price you did not bargain for. That night I did not sleep. I walked through the house like someone cataloging the rooms for the last time. I touched the table where we ate, the chair with the faded cushion he refused to replace because he said, "It's been with us forever." I opened drawers and found the usual, old receipts, his pen, insurance cards. It was all mundane until my hand closed on a spare key I had tucked for years under a magnet in the toolbox. I had kept it for silly reasons, an eventuality, a mislaid key at a cousin's wedding, a helpfulness that felt comforting. I held it now and felt both foolish and grateful for my own preparation. The decision to look through his study was not dramatic. I used the key. I did not break or force anything. I opened the leather-bound desk, the one that used to creak and make us both laugh about how serious he looked writing grocery lists there. The room smelled faintly of cedar and the tobacco he hadn't been able to quite give up. I told myself I would only look for simple things, the bank book, perhaps, numbers that would help me sleep at night. How naive that sounds now, to imagine a single ledger would repair the hole in my chest. What I found at first were the little unremarkable things, appointment cards, a travel brochure, a folder marked home. I sifted through with hands that were careful and trembling, like someone combing for a lost ring. Then there was an envelope, thick with paper. It was legal-looking, stamped with a county seal I recognized. My name was on it. My breath tightened. I opened it and read the deed aloud in the lamplight to make the letters real, the property described, the legal boundaries, and most of all, my name as the recorded owner. It should have been a comfort, I suppose, but for the space of a breath, it felt like a betrayal that he'd let me be kept away from the knowledge that mattered. He had not told me the deed sat under his hand. He had let me assume I was not the one with title to what we called ours. And worse, the realization put Claire's words into a new light. If she thought I was penniless, it was because someone, him, had shaped our financial story so she could believe whatever served their purposes. Behind the deed, folded tight like a secret, were emails printed and annotated in his handwriting. The subject lines were banal: quarterly transfers, consultation, payment schedule. But in the body, names linked to accounts surfaced, and a phrase that did not need to be loudly spoken to be damning. The transfer needs to go through by the end of the quarter, or your husband will notice. It was a line I would later read over and over like a litany. I made paper copies. My handwriting shook as I dated each printout and tucked them in a plain manila folder. There was a small flash drive wrapped in tape and lodged behind a stack of envelopes. I had no idea why he kept such a thing in his desk. It could have been for movies, a collection of family photos, trivial things. I slid it into my pocket as if it could warm me. Later, in the quiet of my kitchen, with a cup of coffee long cold beside me, I plugged it into my old laptop. The files were clinical: PDFs, spreadsheets, receipts with highlighted entries. There were bank transfers marked with unfamiliar account names, accounts in other names entirely. I printed what I could. I made screenshots. I labeled everything with the date and time, being meticulous, because I had learned, in the rawness of that early night, that carefulness felt like armor. There is a peculiarity to collecting your own proof. You feel like a thief in your own life. You worry you will misstep and become the person you feared. But there's also a sterile clarity to it. Documents are unblinking, and the paper does not lie about numbers. When emotion threatens to collapse into something unreadable, a spreadsheet can be a map, and I needed a map. At dawn, I called Elaine. My voice sounded small on the other end of the line, and she listened without the hurriedness of other people who do not have the long history of a friendship like ours. We had known each other since our children were small. She had an easy, steady sort of patience that made people tell her things they might not tell others. I told her the barest truth, and then the rest in a tangle. She came over with soup in her hands and stayed the day, both as witness and as someone who would help me keep my feet on the ground. "I don't want you to make a move you can't take back," she said, setting out a plate. "Let the anger not be what guides the hand." "Anger is not the enemy," I answered. "It's a muscle. It can be useful if it doesn't govern everything." We sorted papers. We made lists. The kitchen table became a battlefield of documents and old stationery, sticky with the mark of tea. Elaine held my hand at one point and told me stories of other women she knew who had rebuilt after storms. She mentioned the idea of telling my son, of bringing this into daylight in a way that wouldn't rip him apart. I thought of him asleep in his life like a child in a safe room and felt my throat burn. The consideration of his feelings did not stop me from wanting the truth to be out. If Frank had lied to him for years, if Claire had manipulated his trust, they would not be spared by silence. I called a lawyer. I hadn't wanted to, not yet. I wanted instead to be the woman who, like in the old novels, sat at a window and wrote a long letter, signed it, and set it aside. But reality isn't composed of tidy sentences and closure with a flourish. I needed counsel. I called Michael because he had represented a friend once, and because there is something to familiarity when your life is tilting. He took an appointment the next day. Michael was younger than I imagined a good lawyer should be, less graying and more habitual in a way that made him efficient. He listened, and he did not speak as if my story were entertainment. He took the folder I offered with a pair of gloved hands, almost ceremonious, like someone handling old manuscripts. He asked questions in a measured, uninjured tone. "When did you see the transfer? What copies do you have? Who else knows?" He did not ask why I had used a spare key. He stuck to the facts I had collected and what that evidence could demonstrate. "It changes things," he said at one point, not with triumph, but with a sort of professional assessment. "If these documents are authentic, and they look like they are, there are financial moves that will need explaining." He didn't promise victory. No one had the right to promise such things. What he did promise was that the documents would be used, that there would be a method, that we would approach this with legal channels, and that he would handle the rest. We arranged to copy everything, to secure backups. He instructed me to keep the original somewhere safe and to snapshot what I had. He advised gently and always circumspectly, that I avoid any interactions that could be spun against me. No confrontations at the door, no angry emails I might later regret. It felt like being told by a doctor to rest after surgery, practical, necessary, and deeply unromantic. In the days that followed, life turned into a balance of ordinary motion and careful strategy. I went to book clubs, to the garden center for New Calmia, to the church fundraiser where I had volunteered for years. I spoke with neighbors in the same way I always had. Appearances were armor. Inside, I was methodical. I copied bank statements, photographed receipts, cataloged dates and names. I made a list of the transfers that looked odd to me. Routines returned like a tide that can both hide and reveal things depending on when you stand to watch it. They began to notice. It was small at first, an early morning call from Frank asking where I had been, a voice that tried to resume normalcy as if nothing had cracked open. I kept calls brief and neutral. Then came the veiled threats, the sort meant to unsettle. A car idling across from my house at night. A note slid under the door that said only, "Let it go." Claire called once and said, in the syrupy voice she used at holidays, "We should talk. We can fix this." It was not a question. It was an attempt to make me into someone who could be placated. "No," I said into the phone, and the word felt like a small seal. "No, we can't. Not like this." They came to the door once. Claire stood on my porch with a posture of wounded offense and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Behind her, Frank's jaw was hard. He looked older in the face. They spoke in platitudes. How could this have happened? Didn't we all make mistakes? Then they dressed the requests in charm that tried to shame me into silence. There was a man I had once called friend, my husband, placed in the role of a man making bargains. I closed the door. Elaine stayed over again that night. We sat at the kitchen table, the folder of documents between us. The house hummed with the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock. We drank tea and listened to the small town sounds filter through the windows. There is an odd intimacy to sitting with evidence of betrayal that is legal in tone and personal in content. Paper and feeling, strung together on that table like beads. Detective Hayes called at one point, an official-sounding voice on a number I had to place before my brain registered. He didn't pressure me, only asked if I had concerns about safety and if I wanted anything documented. He advised that if there were clear attempts at intimidation, I should preserve any messages or notes. I told him about the car and the note and about how the porch visit made me feel uneasy. He said he'd check in and gave me instructions in that flat, efficient way the world uses when it wants to be kind but not intrusive. I began to make plans that had nothing to do with vengeance. They were quiet. Where would I go if I needed to leave? Who would take care of my plants? Who would know the alarm code? These were exercises in survival and ownership. I wanted to put things in order, as if preparing a house for sale, even though I had no intention of selling. The act of cataloging the life we had built felt like reclaiming it piece by piece. One afternoon, Michael suggested we make a preemptive filing to protect certain assets, to create a traceable legal demand that would prevent sudden moves. The words were technical, and I watched them like a doctor watching an x-ray. He asked if I wanted to notify my son now or later. My fingers tightened around the teacup. "If you tell him now," Michael said, "he might react in a way that complicates things. If I tell him later," I said, "and he finds out in public, I will have taken that away from him." We scheduled a time for him to come to the house. He would take only what would be necessary for the legal file. He asked for the originals of the deed and the email printouts. I handed them to him as if giving over intimate memories. He placed them in a dark folder, the kind that makes things official, even when the thing inside is a deed you already knew was yours. After he left, I sat by the window and watched a line of geese cross the sky. It is a small comfort watching geese move in a pattern older than you. In the kitchen, the clock ticked. There was a faint satisfaction in the knowledge that I had the deed, that in the nervous little ledger of life, a line had my name written on it. It did not erase the pain.
It simply meant the basic fact of ownership could be verified on paper and in law. For Claire, who had assumed my poverty, it was a miscalculation she had not accounted for. For me, it was a lifeline. They escalated then. in ways that were thinly veiled but unmistakable. Anonymous emails with menacing undertones meant to unsettle my sleep. A woman from his office called to ask me not to make waves because it would be hard on the kids. A stranger sent a letter suggesting I forget the whole thing. Once, a delivery arrived with a bouquet of flowers and an unsigned card that read, "Some things are better left alone." I kept the flowers in a vase on the sill and watched them droop like a metaphor. My son called one evening. His voice had the rasp of someone trying not to shudder. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked. "I'm starting to be," I answered. "But you should know some things. Sit down." We spoke for a long time. He was furious and disoriented and protective in a way that made me ache. He asked questions that were sharp and necessary. Where did you see this? What did Frank do? Why did he do this? And he begged, almost in the way of a parent, for me to be careful. I thought for a moment how strange the parent-child cycle is. The child becomes the protector in a way no one imagined. When the call ended, the house felt too quiet. I walked through rooms and touched a clock, a bowl, the edge of a rug. Ownership had always been a cluster of small things. The way you know which chair is yours at the table, the mug that isn't someone else's. The deed made ownership official on paper, but the life that belonged to me was woven through in those small private details. There was a kind of stubborn comfort in that. Messages from Clara began to change tone, as if she too was adjusting her strategy. Once she left a note at my mailbox, no signature, only a sentence. "We can make this right." It felt theatrical. A stage set piece dropped into my actual life. I saved the note. Michael told me to save everything. He said the accumulation of pattern matters in court. He used the word pattern as if assembling a necklace of small beads into something larger. I started to document even the ordinary moments with a new eye. A receipt from the grocery store with a timestamp that showed where I had been the night a supposed transfer occurred. A photo of a piece of mail with an imprinted postmark. The work was tedious and necessary. It taught me how small, quotidian things can outweigh dramatic gestures. Evidence is boring, he told me, in the best possible way. One afternoon, I found myself looking at the deed again, at my name printed there in legal type, and thought about Claire's assumption. She had not bothered to check. She had assumed because it was convenient to assume. That thought taught me something about people. They will allow themselves to believe what suits them until the world proves otherwise.
It also taught me something about my own invisibility. Being assumed poor is not the same as being weak. It can be an error imposed on you, and sometimes the way to reclaim yourself is to let those errors be revealed. The town began to hint at gossip. I saw a face I knew avert their eyes in the grocery aisle. A woman I barely recognized at the library gave me a look of pity. The social consequences were small at first, then bristling. People like stories with a clear villain and a tragic heroine. I found that those stories always prefer to assign blame to someone, and the truth is never that tidy. I leaned on Elaine and a few steady friends who would not ask for details, but who offered dinners and knitting afternoons, and the ritual stability of small talk. They tried other tactics. A man arrived at my door one late morning with a camera, claiming to be a hobbyist photographing old townhouses. He asked questions about the property with the kind of casual curiosity that was meant to feel benign. I asked him for his name and license, and he left, embarrassed. Later, a tabloid email with photographs taken from a distance arrived in my inbox, crude and invasive. It felt like a violation of a private life for the sake of a sensational headline. I would not let them make the story into a circus. Michael had put an injunction in place, temporary measures to freeze anything that looked like sudden movement of accounts, and the legal wheels, slow and steady, creaked into action. The deed, the emails, the transfers, the drive, those were the spokes of the wheel that marked a path forward. I did not sing about victory. I simply woke up each morning and did the work of being present in my life, while the law did the work of sorting truth from fabrication. One night, alone in the living room with the curtains open and the streetlight painting a soft rectangle on the rug, I thought of the pie. The crust had been beautiful in a way I did not appreciate at the time. Later, I would think of that dropped pie as a symbol of innocence lost, of the ordinary things that denote home. For now, it was still simply a dish in the sink. Small domestic things kept me anchored. I wrote in a notebook, a practice I hadn't kept since my son was smaller, and I found the rhythm of sentences a repair. I began, quietly, to consider possibilities I had once thought extravagant. Selling the house and moving to the coast, writing the kinds of letters I liked to read, starting a blog where women could speak without performance, a place that would become the quiet table. Those ideas were not triumphalist. They were simple, steady things that felt possible because I had, quietly and with stubborn care, preserved a legal fact, a piece of paper that bore my name. But before any of that could be real, there were more calls, more meetings, more documentation. Frank called one evening with a voice that had that old familiar softness. "Can we meet?" he asked. "No," I said. "Not alone."
"At least talk to me," he pleaded. "Not like that," I replied. "If there's anything to say it to Michael. I'm not going to handle your explanations without counsel." He was silent a long time. When he spoke again, it was small. "This will hurt people." "Then stop hurting people," I said. He didn't come over. He sent a message instead, which Michael advised me to save. It was both apology and plea, a thing people write when they want to be both fragile and forgiven. I set the phone face down and watched the screen blink in the dark. When Michael came to see me the next morning, he had a seriousness about him that was not the abruptness of bad news, but the certainty of someone doing their job exactly. He laid out options: services to freeze accounts, requests to bar Claire from certain corporate documents where she had been inserted, and practical steps to make sure assets could not be moved in haste. He said simply the deed was crucial. "She never looked," he said. "They assumed a narrative, and that assumption will be useful to us. It shows intent." That observation landed like a cold fact, and then softened into something else, the recognition that what they had assumed would be the thing to undo them. There was no gloating in his tone. He was reminding me that the world sometimes operates on the small errors of those who are careless. I drove to the post office that afternoon to mail a letter I had drafted to my son, full of the things a mother needs to say when her child's life becomes entangled with another's deceit. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the envelope, and thought about how ownership is both a legal fact and a set of stories we tell ourselves. As I dropped it into the mailbox, I felt a small, private satisfaction. Not because I had made them pay, but because I had not been erased. There was a knock at the door in the late afternoon, a hesitant, almost sheepish tap. I opened to find Claire, her hair slightly too perfect, her face a practicing canvas. She looked at me with the sort of manufactured sorrow people use in theaters. "Marilyn," she said, "I didn't want it to come to this." "I didn't want it either," I answered, "but you left me a choice." She stood on my porch and fiddled with her phone as if she had rehearsed 100 lines and couldn't decide which one to deliver. "You could make this easier," she said finally, which was the language of power wrapped in negotiation. "This isn't a negotiation about convenience," I said. "This is about the truth." She left a card with her name and an old address. I put it in the folder. Later, when I was alone again with the quiet, I looked at the deed and the printouts and thought, she had assumed a lie because it served her. She had never thought to check the single piece of paper that would unmake her assumption. It is a strange thing, feeling vindicated by paper. It is a quieter triumph than rage or public shaming. It does not annihilate the memory of the laughter at the window or the image of the pie on the stone. It is rather the small and steady act of saying, "No, that is not true," and having the world recognize the statement in its own language, law, declared and recorded. That night, I slept for the first time in a week, not the sleep of oblivion, but the sleep of someone who has made a step forward. The house stood around me like a patient animal at rest. The next morning, the phone rang early. It was Michael. "We should consider a filing," he said. "There are documents I want in the record." "Are we ready?" I asked. I could hear the files shuffling in his office. "We are as ready as we will be," he said. "We have the deed, the transfers, the emails, the pattern." "Make it careful," I told him. "Make it precise." "That's the plan." I hung up and held the receiver for a while like someone holding a map. The thing about defense is that it is often a quiet, tedious accumulation of small, heavy steps. It is not the dramatic first act in a play, but the long middle where endurance matters. Outside, the town went about its slow day. Someone walked a dog, a lawnmower approached with mechanical insistence. I stood at the window and thought of the kitchen table we had used for years, the paper plates from birthdays stacked in the pantry, the scuffed chairs with names on them in my head. Ownership, I repeated to myself quietly, is a matter of saying your name and having it written in a place that cannot be easily erased. Later, as the sun leaned west and the day became a trailing gold, a car pulled into my drive and then stopped. I watched from the window as Frank got out and stood on my lawn for a long minute, hands in his pockets, looking at the house, at me, at some private horizon. He carried himself with the old ease and an added shadow of defeat. He lifted his hand in a gesture that could have been a wave or a surrender. I did not go out. I made tea instead and let him stand there like a figure in a painting. I had not yet told the town everything. There were still legal boxes to check, still counsel to be sure. The deed was a lifeline, but it was not a finale. I had secured a fact that could not be denied on its face. My name on the paper. But people can still hurt. People can still try to make the world bend to their will. The days ahead would not be easy. There would be hearings and motions and headlines and small cruelties, and also the slow, patient business of reclaiming a life. I closed the curtains a little earlier that night. I placed the spare key in a jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother, and set it on the mantel as if it were a talisman. The document in the folder had my name on it. The mailbox had echoes of Claire's notes. The phone messages had patterns that told stories.
I thought of the women who would later sit around a table I had not yet imagined, cups of tea in their hands, speaking softly about how to rebuild after betrayal. For now, I had the deed, the documents, and a lawyer whose voice was steady at the other end of the line. For now, my hands had relearned a new kind of skill, to collect evidence not for the sake of revenge, but to anchor truth. When I turned out the lights, the house was quiet. The world felt a fraction more honest that night, because a piece of paper carried my name, and because someone had assumed the wrong thing. She had never checked the deed. That was the moment I kept folding over in my head, the small arrogance of her assumption. It would not, by itself, right many things, but it would be a hinge. I slept knowing tomorrow would bring more calls and more small strategies. The pie was still in the sink. The hydrangeas drooped slightly in the dusk. I held in my palm the spare key, like a small secret promise. And somewhere between the irregular tick of the clock and the hush of the house, I felt the shape of a new life take form, slow, careful, and anchored in a name recorded on paper. Morning arrived with the same small things that had steadied me before. Light through curtains, a kettle that clicked, the town beginning its low machinery of days. It felt, absurdly, like a performance I had to learn to play again. I made myself tea. I found the old blue mug with the chip on the rim, the one that had always seemed to hold luck for trivial errands, and sat at the kitchen table where the folder of papers lived like a quiet presence. Michael called soon after breakfast to say he'd filed the papers and that a date had been set for a hearing. He spoke without melodrama, and I listened as if hearing someone discuss weather. He explained next steps in that precise, patient way that removed drama and left only work. When I walked to the mailbox that afternoon to drop off a few notes, people watched me with an odd mixture of curiosity and pity. A neighbor I barely knew nodded across the street, the kind of nod you give someone who has lost a companion to illness. It struck me again how private the rupture felt, even as the world tilled toward talking. I held my head high. The deed and the folder weighed in my bag like a small fact to be carried. The summons to court came in a sober envelope. I remember the sensation of reading the date and then feeling everything else settle into an unfamiliar choreography. Find a dress that said respectable but not performative. Rehearse simply what I would say if asked. Breathe when the room felt too loud. Elaine offered to accompany me, and though she is not the sort of person who enjoys formalities, she dressed as if to show me that ordinary dignity can be armor. You don't have to do theater, she said. Just be yourself and let truth do the rest.
There are films that make courtrooms cinematic, thunderous proclamations, dramatic reveals, camera angles that turn telling into spectacle. Real courtrooms are workrooms. They are fluorescent lights and files, and a rhythm of evidence presented like piano keys struck one by one. The hearing was early in the morning. The courthouse smelled of coffee and old leather. I felt the familiar tick of the clock inside me that had become steady over these weeks. Michael sat at my side with an open brief and a calm I had come to rely upon.
He introduced himself to the clerk. He introduced me as the person who had presented evidence and sought relief. At his signal, I knew the moment of truth would be less about his flourish and more about the small, relentless quality of the documents he'd gathered. That was the advantage we had, an accumulation of ordinary things that together formed a clear pattern. When he stood, he did not raise his voice. He spoke in a voice that matched the rhythm of the room, concise, methodical. He presented copies of the bank statements, the printed emails, the spreadsheets that had once felt like a strange foreign language and which now read like testimony in their columns. He walked the judge through the transfers, the timing, the names of accounts that had received funds. He placed the deed on the table with a steady hand and asked that it be admitted as evidence. My name there, ink on paper, felt physical in a way that no memory alone could ever be. I watched Frank in the audience. He wore a suit that looked as if he'd been measured for someone else. On his face was a brittle composure, like a varnish covering older wood. Claire sat a few rows ahead of him, her back stiff as if she had rehearsed posture for weeks. I noticed trivial things about them, the small adjustments they made to seem composed, the way Frank rubbed his thumb along his jaw, the way Claire fixed her hair as if making herself real. The son was not in the room. Michael had advised giving him space, believing he would be called if he needed to be. He would later tell me he had chosen distance because everything felt raw, and he feared being the axis upon which public shame would swing. There were moments during the hearing that felt almost procedural, a clerk asking for authentication, a judge glancing at pages, a lawyer for the other side objecting on narrow grounds. But the heart of it was the paper trail. Michael asked for each item to be read into the record. The emails with the line I had circled in the lamplight were there. The printouts from the flash drive were there. The bank entries, the pattern of transfers, small, regular, then suddenly urgent, were there. It was not melodrama. It was small arithmetic made human, names and numbers drawn into meaning. When Michael drew the judge's attention to the deed, there was a small stillness in the room. He did not cry victory from the bench.
He pointed out the obvious, that my name was on the document, that ownership had legal weight, that the pattern suggested transfers into spheres controlled by Claire that required explanation. He asked that temporary measures be put in place to prevent the dispersal of assets and to clarify the ownership of the property. For the first time since the beginning of the nightmare, I felt something inside me ease, a careful, legal recognition that the truth had not been hidden from law, only from my life. At one point, when Michael referenced the downloaded files from the flash drive, Claire's composure thinned. Her hand tightened on her notebook. A color left her face. Frank's jaw loosened for a moment, and something like panic surfaced, then receded into a practiced face. They had assumed the story would be theirs to shape. The deed, quietly stubborn, did not let them. The judge's voice, when he spoke, was measured. He did not make pronouncements that belonged to headlines. He ordered the measures Michael had requested. Freezes were necessary, temporary alterations to corporate listings that so far had allowed Claire to appear in positions she did not have the authority to claim, and a directive for further discovery to be conducted. That language, the legal machinery, felt dense but precise, like a plumb line set to a wall. The hearing concluded without fanfare, but the outcomes were practical and binding in ways that mattered. We were not yet done, but the path was clearer. Outside the courthouse, the light seemed unnaturally bright, like a filter that smoothed edges. A reporter approached the steps, microphone in hand, asking if I would say anything. Michael steered us away, reminding me that statements could be twisted and that the legal record was what mattered. I felt both relief and a small sting. Public attention had shifted from private curiosity to an actual disturbance. People whispered in the square as if they were watching a play. I refused interviews. I wanted the truth to breathe on its own, to be heard where it counted. Word traveled fast in a town like ours. Within days, the local paper ran a cautious piece about a legal dispute involving a well-known family, and the rumor mill took the skeleton and embroidered it with color. There were, inevitably, messages from folks I had not spoken to in years, some offering support, others offering wary sympathy from a distance. The son texted me a photograph of the empty plate on his kitchen counter with a short message. "I'm sorry, Mom." He did not ask for details. He didn't need to. His apology was both for what had been done and for the way truth hurts when it touches those you love. The pressure on Frank and Claire increased. There were private conversations that Michael relayed, phone calls to board members at a small company where Claire had been listed, requests to remove her from certain documents, and the quiet severing of ties by people who did not want to be entangled in legal fog.
Frank's work relationships frayed. I received one letter from a man who had worked with him for decades. It expressed regret and an apology for not noticing what had happened. It was short and earnest. I folded it into the folder I carried like a talisman of the ordinary, responsive humanity that still existed around the edges of betrayal.
They tried, in small ways, to make the world spin back as if nothing had occurred. Once, a mutual friend invited us both to an event on the assumption we could be civil in public. I declined. The notion that civility could exist in the same room as unadmitted facts felt like asking the ocean to stop tides. I did, however, go to a small memorial service for a neighbor. Life, in its small mercies, continued. Funerals and graduations and birthday takes did not pause for my reconciliation with truth. There was a day, one I remember especially because of the weather, when Michael called to say that certain documents had been returned with clarifying annotations that supported our position. He did not boast. He simply remarked that the paper confirmed a pattern they could not ignore. I sat in my car at the grocery store, hands on the steering wheel, and felt the world tilt in a more comfortable direction. It was not a triumph so much as a settling of accounts. The law had recognized what I had found at the kitchen table in the quiet hours. The deed had done its work. When the town learned more, reactions widened. Some people expressed disappointment in Frank in small ways. A withdrawn invitation, the absence of polite company. Others pointed fingers. I tried not to look at the faces of strangers when they glanced my way. I preferred the worn, honest faces of friends who came with soup or garden cuttings. Elaine was a constant. There were nights when she would come with a card game and make me laugh at things that had nothing to do with hearings. Laughter was its own kind of repair work. The son, when he finally came to see me, brought a wild, awkward energy that was his way of being present. He apologized again, more fully this time, for being caught between loyalty to his father and his love for me. "I don't know who to be angry at," he said, "and that's the worst part." "Be willing to be angry at deeds, not at people," I told him. "Anger is a tool, use it with care, and don't let others make your choices for you." We spoke about simple things, a family recipe, a photograph he'd taken of us on the beach when he was small, and in that exchange I felt something mend. He later told me he had frozen his accounts as Michael had advised, and that he would cooperate in any process that clarified facts. He was spare with his public presence for a while, as if he needed to keep a private life from being pulled apart in a town where every street corner could become a question. The hearings continued in small installments: depositions, meetings with Michael, discovery sessions. There were days when I would arrive home exhausted and sit with my hands in the dishpan, scrubbing something, until the ordinary task soothed me. There is an odd sanctity in doing simple work when your world has been shaken. It asserts that life is more than the tumult of headlines. Still, each document added up. Each transcript filled in shapes that made patterns understandable and therefore actionable. One afternoon, months into the process, we were given a moment that felt decisive, not because the judge shouted, but because the facts on paper finally made the narrative coherent in a public way. An interim order was issued. Some accounts were subject to restriction, certain corporate roles were to be clarified, and specific transfers were ordered to be explained. The language was dry, but effective. It meant the bank could not simply allow funds to flow as if nothing had happened. It meant oversight. It meant the habits of avoidance that had sustained deceit had to be answered. When that order came, newspapers had already started to lean into the story. A headline appeared that tried to make sense of the fracture without being salacious. Local matriarch challenges financial moves. It was careful, but I felt my face in print and felt the strange sensation of being both known and kept at a distance. The son called to say he was proud. He said it in a way that sounded like offense softened into affection. Frank's defenses frayed. He stopped returning certain calls. Clemency was not a thing I sought. I could have wanted his remorse to be loud and performative, but I had learned from the evidence that remedies were made in the right places: banks, records, registries, not in platitudes. Avoiding him felt like a mercy for all involved. Claire's posture in town shifted. She had been a presence at parties and gatherings, a woman whose part in community calendars had been small but visible. People who had once smiled at her now offered a measured distance. That is not to say she was publicly shamed with glee. Most of my acquaintances understood that other people's marriages are private disasters. But in our small place, people are always watching to see whether those who pulled at the wires of others' lives will be accountable. The social consequences were modest but real. Fewer invitations, fewer friendly calls, a slow erosion of the ease with which she'd moved through circles. I did not rejoice in their discomfort. My delight, if I had any, was domestic and inward, a safe feeling that the factual record had been acknowledged and that the paper with my name could not be erased by rumor. There were quiet moments when I felt relief like a pale, warm thing in my chest. When the final day of a key hearing arrived, Michael instructed me to rest and to dress simply. He had prepared a bundle of exhibits and had rehearsed the chronology until the sequence felt inevitable in his hands.
He asked that I sit quietly while he walked the judge through the transfers and the deed and explained the patterns of movement that suggested behavior incompatible with the normal stewardship of family assets. At a certain point, he looked at me and said with the smallest of smiles, "You did your part by keeping the paper, Miss Gray. We are simply showing the world what paper demonstrates." The sentence landed with a gravity that made me proud, not because of triumph, but because of the ordinariness of the act, keeping what belongs to you. I sat on the bench and felt the room's acoustics shape each spoken phrase. When Michael presented the chain of emails that included the line I'd write by lamplight, the directive about transfers, and the notation that funds had to be moved to avoid notice, the defense's counsel objected on grounds that were procedural and predictable. Michael answered each one with patience. The judge listened, not to spectacle, but to the slow accrual of facts. When he spoke to the courtroom to explain the principle behind his decision, he did so in a voice that felt like weather, inevitable, not personal. He ordered relief that stabilized the immediate situation, some restrictions on account access, a clear mapping of assets so they could not be shifted in private, and directions to rectify records that had been altered. It was enough. It was also not the end. The process had not been clean. Trust cannot be restored by orders. But the law had set boundaries, and within those boundaries I could plan. After the hearing, people whispered on the courthouse steps. A photographer snapped a distant photo. I felt eyes on me, and yet a separate inner quiet that wasn't about performance. I had preserved a name on paper, and that small, stubborn fact had altered the balance. In the days after the major rulings, Frank resigned from a committee he had served on for years. It was a small local committee, nothing glamorous, but his stepping down was a sign that his public life had been rearranged. Claire lost some of the positions that had given her local stature. The son continued to live in town, but kept a cautious distance from local chatter. We spoke sometimes, short calls that were more about the weather than the wound, though occasionally he would say something that cracked me open in a good way, an offer of help, an insistence that I take time to breathe. There were other things I had to do. The fridge contained jars of last season's preserves that needed labeling. The garden needed pruning. But in the space the rulings had created, I began to realize what I wanted next. Ownership had legal weight. It also gave me the agency to choose where to live and how to let the next chapters unfold. I had always loved the sea in a way that was more religious than aesthetic. I found myself imagining the sound of waves at night the way some people imagine prayer.
The decision to move was not a rejection of memory, but an acceptance of the necessity to find a place where new patterns could take root. I considered selling the house we had filled with birthdays and winter holidays. The deed was mine in legal form. The house was mine in memory. Letting it go felt like a radical act of faith. Friends came with boxes in time. They carried things and held conversation like loaves of bread. The son helped, steady and practical, carrying framed photos and telling small stories about the children we had once watched grow. There were moments of tenderness amid the domesticity, a photograph found in the back of a drawer, a letter written by a child and kept in a box. These artifacts were more precious than gold. When the moving day arrived, I stood on the porch and turned a slow circle through rooms that held laughter and quiet anger and the ordinary accumulation of life. The hydrangeas had dried into papery blooms. I picked a few and slipped them into a pocket. Before I locked the door for the last time, I placed the spare tea, the one I'd tucked into my grandmother's jewelry box, into a small tin and walked to the pier. The ocean was cool and vast. I have always been partial to the particular scent of salt on the air, to the way horizon lines seemed to promise unscripted days. I held the key for a long moment and thought of the kitchen table where I had assembled the first evidence, of the pie that had fallen in the morning light, of the deed that had quietly been the hinge of everything. I could not throw away the object that had been part of the story. I didn't want a theatrical gesture of revenge, but I wanted a closure that had the softness of an end. So I walked to the edge and let the key fall into the surf. It hit the water with a small metallic note and disappeared beneath the churning. A gull pried somewhere, as if confirming the act. I watched until the tide folded the ripple away. It was not dramatic. It was intimate. A private way of letting go that felt like something I had earned. Once settled in a smaller house on the coast, white paint, a small porch, a kettle that sang with a distinctive pitch, I started to write. The quiet table began, at first, as letters I wrote to myself. I painted a header,
wrote about small domestic rituals, and then tentatively posted the first entry, a description of the way to make chamomile tea and a memory of an apple pie that had taught me more than pastry could have foreseen. I did not write to indict. I wrote about the slow recoveries of daily life, things like how to label preserves, how to tend a hydrangea, how to sit with friends and not be ashamed of the tears that come up for seemingly no reason. The blog grew in its own modest way. Women began to write back, notes that were sometimes private and sometimes full of the small bravery that comes from being understood. They sent recipes, short stories, and letters about leaving jobs, marriages, or towns. They wrote about learning to like themselves in the afternoon light. I started posting short essays called At the Quiet Table, where I spoke without rhetoric about the ordinary facts that stitch a life together. The name felt right because there is, I had learned, a power in shared quiet, a place where stories can be told without sound effects or demands. Elaine and a few others formed a weekly gathering. We called it literally and simply the Quiet Table. We met with tea and biscuits, sometimes with knitted things, sometimes with books folded open. Women came with different stories: young mothers frightened by bankruptcy, a retired teacher taking up painting again, a veterinarian who had lost a partnership that dissolved overnight. No one offered solutions as if they were recipes. People offered their presents and dinners and knitting needles. We shared advice when it was asked for and sat in silence when that was better. The son visited frequently. Our relationship, though altered, grew steadier. We took long walks where conversation could be hedged and soft. He told me of small triumphs at work. I told him about the blog and a woman who had written to say my words had helped her leave an abusive situation. There were awkward moments, of course, times when a phrase would sidle into a memory of the betrayal and the hurt would bloom again. But those moments passed, smoothed by ordinary routines: coffee with friends, repairing a fence, reading at the library. The town's gossip eased. Time is not kind in the way it erases fully, but it does give room for other stories to grow. I found small acts of forgiveness not as absolution, but as pragmatic choices, to not move through the world as if every passerby were a judge. I visited the little bookstore and bought books that smelled of dust and traveling. I learned the names of the fishermen who mended nets, the barista who made the best flat white, the woman at the grocer who loved my winter squash. There were still edges. I received a letter from Claire months later asking for a meeting to clear the air. Michael advised against it and suggested a mediated conversation if it were necessary. I did not meet her.
The wounds were not for mutual adjustment. They were for careful tending in places that did not require the presence of someone who had once helped build the illusion that kept me small. I am not without curiosity, but curiosity does not require reconciliation. I sometimes thought about Frank and the life we'd shared, about the ways in which habits of avoidance can become architectural in a home, about the small silences that grow into rooms of their own. Time had softened my anger into a steady concern. I do not delight in his decreased standing in town. I felt pity in a restrained way. People make choices. Lives change. I have carried and continue to carry a small fold of grief for the loss of someone I once loved. The Quiet Table expanded. We started a small newsletter and then, cautiously, a resource page for women who might be facing ruptures in their lives. We linked to legal aid contacts, community centers, and helplines, all the things Michael had carefully suggested over the months of my ordeal. We did not offer legal advice, only companionship and the knowledge of someone who had walked the path and kept careful documents. There were small victories: an article by a local magazine that asked thoughtful questions about privacy, an invitation to speak at a community luncheon about resilience, a woman who wrote to say a single paragraph I had posted had given her the courage to change jobs. Those notes are the kind of gratitude that does not demand spectacle. They ask only to be held. Once, on an ordinary afternoon when the light over the water was a soft gold, I found myself walking to a small table at the end of the hill where a bench sat facing the sea. I carried with me a paper copy of the deed, one of the many official-looking papers that had changed everything, and placed it beside my tea, half as a reminder and half as a symbol. Someone sat down. It was a woman I had met at the Quiet Table who had just moved to the area after a divorce. We spoke about nothing and everything. She told me she had begun to plant a small garden because she wanted to see, literally, what she could grow. "When you told me to start small," she said, "I thought you meant plant parsley, but I planted trust." I smiled, and without ceremony said what I had come to believe: you can't break what becomes whole.
Small acts stitched the days: writing, gardening, slow dinners with friends, and an occasional trip back to the town where everything had changed. I would go sometimes to meet Michael, to sign a final document, to close a file. He would hand me paper with a practiced gravity, and we would both understand that legal closure is an odd domestic thing, part practical, part ritual. The son, at a time when the world felt less like a stage and more like a home again, invited me to a small family dinner. He had been careful about guest lists and had not asked me to sit where his father might be.
He told me later, with the clumsy tenderness of someone rebuilding trust, that he was glad we were speaking again. I thanked him and said that the small things, knowing which mug to use, remembering to water the basil, were where we could find each other again. As months became years, my life rearranged itself around new rituals. I learned to get up early and walk to the beach before anyone else arrived. I learned the pattern of the tides like a poem. I lined a bookshelf with books that smelled of travel and firelight, and I kept a journal where I wrote letters to women I would never meet. The Quiet Table podcast, small, recorded in my kitchen with a borrowed microphone and friends who had become regulars, became a place where the voice of ordinary recovery could be heard. We read passages from letters. We cooked together over video. We spoke about how to make room for grief and then for joy. Sometimes, when the light had that late summer quality and the kettle hummed on the stove, I would take out the first folder, the folder that had held the deed and the flash drive and the printed emails, and I would look at it with a kind of tender amazement. The paper had been the hinge. It had not been magical. It had been a fact that resisted misrepresentation. The small arrogance of another's assumption that I was broke because I was made small had not held when faced with the quiet persistence of records. When I think back to the pie on the flagstones, I do not see only a symbol of ruin. I see, too, the way ordinary things have a way of returning to ordinary dignity. The pie dish washed clean and stored on a shelf. The hydrangeas pruned and replanted. The key, thrown, not kept in a drawer as a talisman, but released to the surf. There is a particular sweetness in small gestures of letting go. I tell this story now not because I imagine it a moral of triumph, but because I want to offer something practical and humane. When your world fractures, you might find that the path back is less about heroics and more about accumulation, the steady assembling of facts, the careful tending of friendships, the small rituals of a kitchen and a garden. There is a kind of righteousness in the mundane. If you are listening and you have ever felt small, assumed invisible, or economized into someone else's story, remember that there is power in the ordinary. A deed, a name on a paper, a friend who comes with soup, a woman who will sit with you and not say anything at all. Ownership is sometimes simply the willingness to keep the facts close. If this has resonated with you, I hope you'll come sit at the quiet table with us. Subscribe for more stories, not because we love drama, but because we believe in the quiet work of rebuilding. Visit the blog for resources and letters from women who have learned how to make small things steady. Tell me if you like where you're listening from. There's a map growing slowly of women who bring their own cups to the table. I live now with the sound of surf and the daily work of tending a small life. The deed that once felt like a cold piece of paper became a tool, and the people who had assumed my poverty learned, through the force of plain facts, that their assumptions were not destiny. I do not gloat. I do not savor the missteps of others. I keep an eye on the small, steady things. My tea kettle, my friend Elaine's laugh, the son who calls now and then to ask whether he can come for dinner. There is no single moment of victory, only long afternoons of ordinary courage that add up. You can't break what becomes whole. My name is on a piece of paper, and more importantly, it is on a life I continue to shape. If you are sitting with the pieces of your own life, know this: keep the facts, gather your friends, and do the quiet work. The world will not always tell you the truth. Sometimes you must insist it be written down. And then, when the heavy work is done, you may find yourself walking to the shore and letting the last small key fall into the water, not as vengeance, but as a way of saying goodbye and walking forward. If this story touched you, subscribe for more true life testimonies at the Quiet Table, or visit the blog for resources and letters from women rebuilding their lives. Join us. Bring your cup, bring a story, and let the quiet do its steady work.